Welcome, friends, to a story of betrayal, revenge, and unexpected redemption. Enjoy the story. The luxurious bedroom of the Thompson mansion was bathed in soft lamplight, but the atmosphere was far from romantic. Steve Thompson, a handsome man in his early 40s, paced nervously while his mistress, Rita Carson, lounged on the king-sized bed, her red lips curved in a predatory smile. "Darling," Rita purred, her voice dripping with honeyed venom. "We've been over this 100 times. Olivia's not getting any better. We'd be doing her a favor, really." Steve ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, his face a mask of conflict. "I don't know, Rita. Hastening her death? It's one thing to wait it out, but actively causing it? That's murder." Rita rolled her eyes, sitting up and letting the silk robe slip off her shoulder. "Oh, please, it's mercy, Steve. She's suffering, and you know it. Besides," she added, her tone turning sharp, "I'm tired of waiting. I want us to start our life together now." Steve's resolve wavered as he looked at the beautiful woman before him. At 35, Rita was a decade younger than him and light years away from his sickly wife. The promise of a new life, free from the burden of caring for Olivia, was tempting. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rita's smile widened, triumphant. "It's simple, really. You're in charge of her medication. A little too much here, a missed dose there. Nature will take its course, and no one will be the wiser." As Steve nodded slowly, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders, neither of them noticed the blinking light of the baby monitor on the nightstand, a relic from when they'd used this room for their infant son, now repurposed as a way to keep an ear out for Olivia's needs. In another wing of the sprawling mansion, Olivia Thompson lay awake in her hospital-style bed, her frail hand covering her mouth in horror as she listened to her husband plot her demise. Steve crept into the kitchen at dawn, his guilty conscience making every creak of the floorboards sound like a gunshot. To his surprise, Olivia was already there, sitting at the marble island in her wheelchair, a steaming mug of herbal tea clasped in her trembling hands. "You're up early," Steve said, unable to meet her eyes as he made a beeline for the coffee maker. Olivia watched him, her once vibrant green eyes now dulled by illness and betrayal. "Couldn't sleep," she replied softly. "Bad dreams." Steve's hand shook slightly as he poured his coffee. "Listen, Liv," he said, forcing a cheerful tone. "I was thinking we could go for a drive tomorrow. Get you out of the house for a bit. How does that sound?" Olivia's lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That sounds lovely, Steve. It's been so long since we've done anything together." As Steve mumbled something about work and hurried out of the kitchen, Olivia's smile faded. She wheeled herself to the study, where her laptop sat charging. Opening her email, she found a new message from Nick Martinez, the manager of the olive farm she'd inherited from her grandmother. "Mrs. Thompson," the email read, "I hope this message finds you well. As requested, I've been keeping an eye on Mr. Thompson's activities. I'm sorry to report that my suspicions were correct. He's been seen regularly with a woman named Rita Carson, and I've overheard conversations that suggest they're planning to hasten your passing. Please, be careful. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Nick." Olivia closed the laptop, her jaw set in determination. She'd suspected Steve's infidelity for months, but this was beyond betrayal. As she gazed out the window at the sprawling grounds of the estate she'd brought into their marriage, a plan began to form in her mind. Steve Thompson had no idea what was coming. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a beautiful Southern California day that belied the darkness lurking beneath the surface of the Thompson household. Steve helped Olivia into their Mercedes SUV with uncharacteristic gentleness, even tucking a blanket around her legs. "There you go, sweetheart," he said, his voice sickly sweet. "Comfortable?" Olivia nodded, her face a mask of innocence. "Yes, thank you, Steve. This is so thoughtful of you." As Steve closed her door and walked around to the driver's side, Olivia quickly pulled out her phone and sent a text. "On the move, cemetery." They drove in silence, the tension in the car thick enough to cut with a knife. Steve kept shooting nervous glances at Olivia, who gazed serenely out the window, looking for all the world like a woman enjoying a pleasant outing with her loving husband. When they pulled up to the gates of Evergreen Memorial Park, Olivia's eyebrows rose in feigned surprise. The cemetery? Steve, what are we doing here? Steve plastered on a smile that looked more like a grimace. Well, darling, I thought, given your condition, it might be good to make some arrangements. You know, so you don't have to worry about it later. Olivia's hand flew to her chest in mock distress. Oh, Steve, how pragmatic of you. As Steve helped her into her wheelchair, Olivia's sharp eyes caught sight of a familiar pickup truck parked discreetly behind some trees. A small smile played on her lips. They made their way through the immaculately manicured grounds, Steve pointing out various plots and monuments with forced enthusiasm. Olivia played along, asking questions and feigning interest, all the while leading Steve exactly where she wanted him to go. Finally, they reached a secluded area near the back of the cemetery. Two gleaming granite headstones stood side by side, waiting for their final inscriptions. Oh, look at these, Steve, Olivia said, her voice dripping with fake excitement. Aren't they lovely? And there are two. How perfect for us to be together for eternity. Steve's face had gone ashen, beads of sweat forming on his brow despite the mild temperature. Liv, I don't think— No, you don't think, do you, Steve? Olivia's voice had lost all its fragility, suddenly sharp as a razor. You don't think about anything but yourself and that little tart you've been sleeping with? Steve stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock. What? Olivia, I don't know what you're talking about. Save it, Olivia snapped. I know everything. About Rita, about your little plan to help nature along. Did you really think I was that stupid, Steve? That I wouldn't figure it out? Steve's shock quickly morphed into anger. He advanced on Olivia, his fists clenched at his sides. You bitch, he snarled. You've been playing me this whole time? Just as he reached for her, a strong hand clamped down on his shoulder. Steve whirled around to find himself face to face with Nick Martinez, the farm manager he'd always dismissed as a simple laborer. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Thompson, Nick said, his voice low and dangerous. Steve looked wildly between Nick and Olivia, realization dawning on his face. Without another word, he turned and ran, fleeing through the cemetery like a man possessed. As the sound of Steve's panicked footsteps faded, Nick knelt beside Olivia's wheelchair. Are you all right, Mrs. Thompson? Olivia nodded, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her drained. I am now, Nick. Thank you for being here. Nick smiled, his warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners. Always, Mrs. Thompson. Now what do you say we get out of here? I know a great little sushi place that does an amazing omakase. For the first time in months, Olivia felt a genuine smile spread across her face. That sounds wonderful, Nick. And please, call me Olivia. As Nick helped her back to his truck, Olivia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The nightmare of her marriage to Steve was over. Now it was time to start living again. The small Japanese restaurant was a world away from the stuffy, pretentious establishments Steve had always insisted on. Olivia sat across from Nick, marveling at the vibrant colors and artful presentation of the sushi before her. I can't remember the last time I ate in a restaurant, Olivia confessed, picking up her chopsticks with slightly trembling hands. Steve always said it was too much hassle with my condition. Nick's eyes darkened at the mention of Steve. He was wrong about a lot of things, Olivia. Your condition included, I suspect. Olivia paused, a piece of otoro halfway to her mouth. What do you mean? Nick leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. I've been doing some research. The symptoms you've been experiencing, the weakness, the dizzy spells, they're all consistent with low-level poisoning. I think Steve might have been medicating you with more than just your prescribed treatments. The sushi slipped from Olivia's chopsticks, landing with a soft plop on her plate. Oh my God, she whispered, her mind reeling. All this time, he's been making me sick. Nick reached across the table, covering her hand with his. I can't prove it without a thorough medical examination, but it fits. The important thing is, you're away from him now. You're safe. Olivia nodded, trying to process this new information. As she looked at Nick, really looked at him for the first time, she was struck by the genuine concern in his eyes. When was the last time anyone had looked at her like that? Thank you, Nick. she said softly. For everything. I don't know what I would have done without you. Nick's smile was warm and reassuring. You're stronger than you know, Olivia. Now enough heavy talk. Let's enjoy this beautiful meal, shall we? As they savored the exquisite sushi and sipped fragrant green tea, Olivia felt something she hadn't experienced in years: joy. Simple, uncomplicated joy in good food and pleasant company. By the time they finished their meal, Olivia's cheeks were flushed with pleasure, and she'd laughed more than she had in months. As they stepped out into the cool evening air, she turned to Nick with a hint of anxiety. I don't want to go back to the house, she admitted. I can't face it, not tonight. Nick nodded, understanding. I thought you might feel that way. I have an idea, if you're up for a bit of a drive. Olivia hesitated only for a moment before nodding. Lead the way, Nick. I trust you. As they drove out of the city, the sprawling suburbs giving way to rolling countryside, Olivia felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she was finally on the right path. The winding road led them deeper into the hills, the city lights fading behind them as they climbed. Finally, Nick turned onto a gravel driveway, pulling up in front of a charming farmhouse nestled among ancient oak trees. Where are we? Olivia asked, peering out the window curiously. Nick smiled as he came around to help her out of the truck. This is my mother's place. I thought you might like some peace and quiet to recover. As if on cue, the front door opened, spilling warm light onto the porch. A woman in her 60s emerged, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her face creased with laugh lines. Nicholas, is that you? She called out. You're just in time for pie. Nick chuckled, guiding Olivia's wheelchair up the ramp to the porch. Mom, this is Olivia Thompson. Olivia, meet Catherine Martinez, the best pie baker in 3 counties. Catherine's eyes widened in recognition, but to her credit, she didn't miss a beat. Olivia, welcome, dear. Come in, come in. You look like you could use a good meal and a comfortable bed. As they entered the cozy farmhouse, Olivia was enveloped in the scent of cinnamon and apples. The living room was cluttered but clean, filled with well-loved furniture and family photos. It's lovely, Olivia said, feeling tears prick at her eyes. Thank you for having me, Mrs. Martinez. Catherine waved a hand dismissively. None of that Mrs. Martinez business. It's Catherine or Kathy if you prefer. Now let's get you settled. Nick, be a dear and take Olivia's things to the guest room. As Nick disappeared down the hall with Olivia's overnight bag, Catherine knelt beside her wheelchair. Olivia, dear, she said softly, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I want you to know that you're safe here. Stay as long as you need. Olivia nodded, overcome with emotion. Thank you, she managed to whisper. Catherine patted her hand. Think nothing of it. Now, how about that pie? The days at Catherine's farmhouse blended into weeks, and Olivia found herself flourishing in ways she never thought possible. Away from Steve's controlling influence and whatever he'd been slipping into her food and medicine, her health improved dramatically. Nick visited often, sometimes staying for dinner, other times whisking Olivia away for drives through the countryside. Catherine, for her part, seemed to have made it her personal mission to fatten Olivia up, plying her with homemade meals and insisting she try her hand at baking. One sunny afternoon, about a month into her stay, Olivia found herself in the kitchen, flour up to her elbows as she kneaded dough for Catherine's famous apple turnovers. You're a natural, Catherine praised, watching from her perch at the kitchen island. Those hands were made for more than pushing wheelchair wheels, that's for certain. Olivia smiled, realizing with a start that she hadn't used her wheelchair in days. The weakness that had plagued her for so long was all but gone, replaced by a strength she'd forgotten she possessed. Just then, Nick burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement. Olivia, you've got to see this! He was clutching a thick folder, which he spread out on the kitchen table. Olivia wiped her hands on her apron and joined him, Catherine peering over their shoulders. What am I looking at? Olivia asked, scanning the documents filled with medical jargon and legal terms. Nick's eyes were bright as he explained. These are the results of the tests we ran on your hair and nail samples, along with some financial records I obtained from Steve's computer. Olivia's heart raced as Nick laid out the evidence. Steve had indeed been poisoning her, slowly and methodically for years. The financial records showed large payments to a shadowy pharmaceutical company, along with emails discussing dosages and side effects. "Oh, Olivia," Catherine breathed, pulling her into a tight hug. "You poor thing. To think what that monster put you through." Olivia returned the embrace, her mind whirling. "What do we do with this information?" she asked Nick. His expression turned grim. "We take it to the authorities. Steve Thompson is going away for a very long time." As the implications sank in, Olivia felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, vindication, but also a twinge of sadness for the life she'd thought she had. "I need some air," she said softly, heading for the back door. Nick and Catherine exchanged worried glances, but let her go. Olivia wandered through Catherine's beautiful garden, breathing in the scent of roses and lavender. As she reached the old oak tree at the edge of the property, she sank down onto the worn wooden swing hanging from its branches. She didn't know how long she sat there, gently swaying, when she felt a presence beside her. Nick settled onto the swing, his shoulder brushing hers. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked gently. Olivia sighed, leaning her head against the rough bark of the tree. "I'm just processing, I suppose. It's a lot to take in." Nick nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed, Olivia. What you've been through, it's more than anyone should have to bear." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the creaking of the swing and the distant call of birds. Finally, Olivia spoke. "I want to press charges," she said, her voice steady. "Not just for me, but for any other women he might hurt in the future. But after that, I think I'm ready to start over." Nick turned to her, his expression a mix of admiration and something deeper, something Olivia wasn't quite ready to name. "Whatever you decide, I'm here for you," he said softly. "We all are." Olivia felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Thank you, Nick, for everything." As they sat there, hands intertwined, watching the sun set over the hills, Olivia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Whatever the future held, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Olivia, with Nick and Catherine by her side, met with lawyers and detectives, sharing her story and the damning evidence they'd collected. Steve Thompson was arrested in a dramatic raid on the mansion, his mistress Rita fleeing the scene only to be caught at the airport with a suitcase full of cash and jewels. The media frenzy was intense, with reporters camped out at the end of Catherine's driveway, desperate for a glimpse of the miracle widow who had risen from her sickbed to bring down her villainous husband. Olivia weathered the storm with grace, giving a single, powerful interview to a respected journalist before retreating back to the sanctuary of the farmhouse. As summer turned to fall, the legal proceedings moved forward. Olivia sat in the courtroom, her head held high, as Steve was sentenced to 25 years in prison for attempted murder, fraud, and a host of other charges. Rita, turning state's witness in exchange for a lighter sentence, sobbed dramatically as she was led away to serve 5 years for her role in the scheme. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by a sea of flashing cameras and shouted questions, Olivia faced the press, with Nick and Catherine flanking her protectively. "I stand here today not as a victim, but as a survivor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "To anyone out there who's suffering in silence, who feels trapped and alone, I want you to know that there is hope, there is life after abuse, and there are good people in this world who will stand by you, even when you feel like you can't stand on your own." As they made their way through the crowd to the waiting car, a reporter called out, "Mrs. Thompson, what are your plans now?" Olivia paused, a small smile playing on her lips. "First, it's Miss Delaney now. I've reclaimed my maiden name. As for my plans, well, I think it's time I started living again." 1 year later. The sun was just peeking over the hills as Olivia stood on the porch of her new home, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. The old farmhouse had been transformed over the past few months, its weathered exterior now gleaming with fresh paint, the gardens bursting with life. Penny for your thoughts? A familiar voice called out. Olivia turned, her face lighting up as Nick climbed the porch steps, a basket of fresh eggs tucked under one arm. Just enjoying the view, she replied, leaning in to kiss him softly. And thinking about how lucky I am. Nick set the basket down and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her close. I'm the lucky one, he murmured against her hair. The sound of a car crunching up the gravel driveway drew their attention. Catherine's SUV came into view, packed to the brim with supplies. Looks like the cavalry has arrived, Olivia laughed, disentangling herself from Nick's embrace to greet her mother-in-law. I brought everything we need for the grand opening, Catherine announced as she climbed out of the car, including 3 of my best pies. Can't have a proper celebration without pie. Today was the day Olivia had been working towards for months, the grand opening of Second Chances, a retreat for survivors of domestic abuse. The idea had come to her during those long healing days at Catherine's farmhouse. Now, with the help of her new family and the settlement from Steve's estate, that dream was becoming a reality. As they bustled about, setting up for the day's festivities, Olivia felt a familiar flutter in her stomach. Pausing in her work, she rested a hand on her slightly swollen belly, smiling at the secret she and Nick were keeping just a little longer. The sound of more cars approaching signaled the arrival of the first guests. Women of all ages began to file in, some with children in tow, all wearing expressions that Olivia recognized all too well, a mixture of hope and trepidation, the look of someone taking their first tentative steps towards freedom. As Olivia stepped up to the podium to give her welcome speech, she caught Nick's eye in the crowd. He gave her a thumbs up, mouthing, "You've got this." Taking a deep breath, Olivia began to speak. Welcome to Second Chances. Each of you has traveled a difficult road to get here, and I want you to know how proud I am of every single one of you. I stand before you not as an expert or a savior, but as a fellow survivor. Someone who knows the darkness you've faced, but who also knows the light that awaits on the other side. As she continued her speech, Olivia saw tears in many eyes, but also something else, a spark of hope, of determination. She knew then that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Later that evening, as the last of the guests departed and the cleanup began, Nick found Olivia sitting on the porch swing, a contented smile on her face. Quite a day, he said, settling in beside her. You were amazing out there. Olivia leaned her head on his shoulder. It felt right, you know, like everything I've been through was leading me to this moment. Nick kissed the top of her head. I'm so proud of you, Liv, and I can't wait to see what you do next. Olivia's hand drifted to her stomach. Well, I think our next big adventure might be arriving in about 6 months, she said softly. Nick's eyes widened as her meaning sank in. Are we? Olivia nodded, happy tears spilling down her cheeks. We're having a baby, Nick! His whoop of joy echoed across the hillside as he scooped her up, spinning her around before setting her gently back on her feet. Oh, Liv, he breathed, dropping to his knees to place a reverent kiss on her belly. I love you so much, both of you. As they stood there in the fading light, arms wrapped around each other, Olivia marveled at the twists and turns her life had taken. From the depths of despair to the heights of joy, she had survived, thrived, and found a love and purpose she never could have imagined. The road ahead would have its challenges, she knew, but with Nick by her side and the strength she'd discovered within herself, Olivia was ready to face whatever came their way. This was her second chance at life, and she intended to make the most of every precious moment.